Last time, of course, I had different lectures last week. I know I had two live stream lectures I had on the Reformation, and I did have a recorded lecture I had, I think, on Friday, which was on world exploration. So I'm kind of going after that period. We're kind of moving on to the period after when the conquistadors come in and all that. So this week I'll be kind of concentrating on the period of when you have really the 16th century. You've got these mostly Spanish soldiers of fortune that come in that tear into the Americas. They kind of spearhead the whole conquest of America, colonization of America that follows after Columbus, discovers parts of the New World. So I'll kind of get into the early stage of that today, and I'll kind of continue more of that, of course, later on, also on Wednesday. I'll kind of split it up because probably won't be able to have the whole thing today about that. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and first talk about, the fact that the Spanish began to arrive more after Columbus's voyages, which, Columbus' voyages were like 1492 up to the early 1500s. And the Spanish would later give the conquest of America kind of a short little nickname. They called it the La Conquista, which meant just, the conquest in Spanish. And I'll kind of talk about, who the conquistadors were. A lot of them were soldiers of fortune that were, in Spain. Spain had been going through a period where they had what they call the Reconquista, where they had conquered like the southern part of Spain, especially from Muslims. And so they had all these soldiers there that were left over. And so they needed something to do. And they heard about the fact that Columbus had discovered all these new lands in the New World. And so a lot of these, went to the New World to seek fortunes.
I can't hear you.
Get gold, and also to get land as well. And so anyway, so that's what it meant. Of course, the word conquistador means basically the conquerors, is what it means, or conqueror. Cortés had a very famous saying he had that you may have heard about before, or may have heard before, which Cortés once said that we Spaniards know a sickness of the heart that only gold can cure. And they actually told the Native Americans this, but that's why they needed gold to cure ailments or whatever, because most of the Native Americans didn't really understand why they wanted gold. They didn't understand the value of it or anything like that. Also, if you study about the early conquistadors, they had things like El Dorado, you may have heard of, which were famous legends that were well known. Which El Dorado is a famous legend of a lost city of gold, which you may have heard about. And it was a story of a mythical king. They called him El Dorado, which the translation of it either means the golden man or the gilded man. And it was a famous story that was circulating in basically, I think, South America, where it was originally. Anyway, basically, a lot of these conquistadors went and searched for it as examples. And I'll give you examples. There was Francisco de Orellana. You may have heard about him. He was a very famous conquistador that explored the Amazon River basin. This is like in the 1540s, searching for it, and of course didn't find it, but he was one of the first to go into the Amazon River and the Amazon jungle and all that in South America. So did, here's of course an image of that, but so did Sir Walter Raleigh, believe it or not. Sir Walter Raleigh in the 1590s also went in search of El Dorado. So El Dorado is a famous story that has been around forever, that people have searched for it in general. I think even up to modern times, they've had people still searching for what they think was gold that might be hidden somewhere in South America. Back in, I think in northern Colombia, north of Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia, there's actually this lake called Lake Guatavita, which they think may be where the legend came from originally about El Dorado. I think there was a story that was circulating that they had some Native Americans that they'd have a new king that would be crowned. They would put him on a raft and put him in the middle of the lake. And he would cover himself with gold dust and jewels, and then he would dive into the actual lake, and all the gold would fall down to the bottom of it. And so a lot of people thought, that's where El Dorado originally was. I think there's even been some people that have searched there too as well. I think recently they may have found gold kind of around that area in Colombia. Of course, Hollywood has made a lot of stories about El Dorado. You may have heard that cartoon that's kind of famous by DreamWorks called The Road to El Dorado. I think you've heard of that one. I think there's even like other stories kind of similar to that they've made movies about as well. I know General Motors, may have mentioned about this, but General Motors, like Cadillac or whatever, Cadillac, of course, had what they call the El Dorado, which they don't make anymore, that type of brand of Cadillac. Now, they also had this other thing they had as well, which, of course, is the legends of the seven cities of gold. You may have heard about that as well. And that's also famous as well, a famous story that's kind of been around, which they think that story might have gone all the way back to ancient medieval times, because there's stories that I think they talk about Herodotus mentioning about similar stories of a lost cities of gold, like in, I think, the old world. I think there's even some of the Alexander Romance stories they mention about it. I think there's even that story I told you before about Prester John. There's some stories that are kind of similar to that are kind of circulating. And also I think the Fountain of Youth is kind of also another story that they kind of throw in there as well. But Cibola Equivera, there were different people that searched for that. I know we'll get to Francisco Coronado, but he was really the most famous one that really searched for that, Cibola. So anyway, let me talk about some early conquistadors that came in. The one of the most famous they always talk about that's well known is Juan Ponce de Leon. He, of course, is considered really one of the most famous of the early conquistadors that first came into the Americas. He's really one of the first Europeans to discover and explore what we call Florida, which the Spanish for a while called the North American aspect of it. They called it Florida. Ponce de Leon, he's an interesting figure. He actually came on some of the early expeditions of Christopher Columbus. I want to say on his second voyage to the Americas. And he was involved in conquering, they think, Puerto Rico, which he later became a governor of it. And when he was on Puerto Rico, he heard some legend that the natives told him about the so-called Fountain of Youth story, which is kind of varied going back to ancient times. I think it's kind of like the whole Cibola Equivera thing that's been around too as well. But they believe that if you drank from this fountain of youth, you would get eternal life. It's almost like the old, maybe even the story about the Holy Grail, that of Jesus, that kind of thing as well. So he took an exhibition you could see up through the Bahamas and discovered Florida in 1513. There's kind of a debate about where exactly he explored in Florida, but some people think he definitely explored up the West Coast, maybe close to where Tampa Bay is, and then up the East Coast as well, towards St. Augustine up there, you see, which the Spanish later founded in the 16th century. But there's even a theory that Ponce de Leon may have also explored as far west into the Panhandle, of Florida. So there's speculation about that. There's like a lot of cities and counties in Florida, of course, named after Ponce de Leon, of course, today. He came back in 1519. He had two expeditions, by the way, to Florida, and he was actually killed on the expedition when some Native Americans shot him with an arrow, and he died afterwards. So that's the story of Ponce de Leon. They consider him and Balboa, I think, the early conquistadors as you really first have that come into the Americas. Then you got Vasco, Nunez, the Balboa, which they were kind of mentioning about in that little short video at the beginning. Balboa was another explorer that came to the Americas. They think maybe in close to about early 1500s overall. And he is famous for, by the way, discovering the Pacific Ocean. He was really the first European to do this. I know you have like Ferdinand Magellan that discovers it later as well. Actually coined the name. The name Pacific Ocean was coined by Magellan. That was, I think, around 1520 when that was. And when he got there, he heard about this, I guess, massive water that was on the other side of the actual isthmus. And so one of the things that he's famous for, Balboa, he was the first European to cross the isthmus of Panama and sight the Pacific Ocean, which he did in 1513. He also, you can kind of see in that map on the bottom right, but he also explored what they call the Pearl Islands, which are off the coast of Panama. He did discover some gold there while he was there. And later he went on to be kind of like this mayor and governor of Panama. And they say he was one of the first really Spanish to help found what they call Panama City, which is now the capital of Panama. But Panama later is part of Colombia at that time. I think he was killed later in 1519, but Balboa, I guess, is the first one to actually find gold, they say. Then they have another explorer that if you have any questions, I'll get to those later. But Panfilo de Narvaez, he's kind of this conquistador that it's kind of been around before. I'll kind of get into him. But Narvaez was involved in this expedition to explore Florida, which was supposed to take place in the late 1520s. A little about him. Narvaez was a conquistador that helped to conquer like Cuba. He was also involved in the conquest of Mexico, which I'll get to Cortés, Hernán Cortés, who's involved later. And this was an expedition that happened right after, of course, Juan Ponce de Leon had explored Florida. So the Spanish wanted to come back and explore it and try to hopefully colonize it. And so the expedition, I think, left Cuba to go to Florida with about 500 men that were with the expedition. And when they got into the Gulf of Mexico, it's believed that the whole expedition got wiped out in a storm. They probably a hurricane, most likely. And only 4 men actually would survive the expedition, which of the 4 men, the one that was the most famous was Alvar Nunez, known as Cabeza de Vaca, which Cabeza de Vaca is actually a nickname, which means head of a cow. And anyway, I think most of the men either drowned or they died afterwards when they came ashore. And then the 4 men that were left over, they actually were captured by Native Americans and were enslaved. Yeah, believe it or not, they were slaves for a while to the natives. And but eventually they escaped, if you know about this. And here's kind of a map of the journey of the expedition. Cabeza de Vaca would actually journey with his men through parts of Texas and into northern Mexico at one point. And the one big thing about Cabeza de Vaca, he's very famous for being one of the first Europeans to really explore that area and learn a lot about the Native American cultures that lived there. And so he was kind of like this proto-anthropologist, studying about the Indian people and even learning their languages and things like that. And he went on to write a book about it, by the way. which was called the account or relation. I think it means the account or the journey or adventures of Cabeza de Vaca, which was later published in 1542. And they think that book was kind of important because it influenced a lot of other conquistadors to come back and really start exploring the Americas more. So that's who Cabeza de Vaca was. But only one of four men actually survived that whole expedition of Panfilo Narvaez, who died on the expedition, by the way. And I think when the Spanish found them later, like in Mexico, they thought they were Indians because they had speaking the language and all that, and they didn't seem like they were European. Now, another famous conquistador who's well known that was involved in exploring, especially in North America, but he was involved in a lot of other expeditions as well. I'll get into, which is Hernando de Soto, who lived in the 16th century, and he was a very famous conquistador that was involved in a lot of expeditions into like the southern part of the United States, what we call the Gulf South now, of course, in the United States, which he was involved in expeditions that were around 1540 to 1542. However, if you study about De Soto, who I think was semi-wealthy from a lot of his expeditions he was involved in, as a conquistador. De Soto was involved in a lot of earlier expeditions. He kind of goes back a long way to like the 1510s, and he was actually involved with this other early conquistador named Francisco Cordoba, who was one of the first Spanish to explore and conquer the Yucatan, which is like the southern part of Mexico. And then some other expeditions even went further down into Central America by the 1520s, and they got all the way down to conquering like Nicaragua, which that is kind of close to Guatemala and all that. And so he was involved in that. Then a lot of people don't know this, but De Soto was also involved too later in the 1530s in helping Francisco Pizarro to conquer Peru. He helped defeat, the Inca Empire, which is in South America. I'll probably talk about that later in the week. But he was a pretty extensive conquistador. I think De Soto is one of the top 5 most famous of the conquistadors overall because he was involved in so many different things as a whole. But yeah, you can see there, at least with the expedition into North America, which I guess is the most famous that we think about in the United States, he does explore a lot of these states we know today. So the area of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, I think pretty much probably went into both South Carolina and North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas. They think some has been pushed into Texas, like the eastern part of Texas as well. They're not sure about Louisiana, but there's some speculation that maybe they could have got into the northern part of Louisiana. But there is one thing that he is very famous for, of course, Hernando de Soto. He was one of the first Europeans to discover and cross the Mississippi River, which he did, they think, in the year 1541. So they think it was near where Memphis, Tennessee is today, where you see that bridge right there. That's the famous Hernando de Soto Bridge, which is part of Interstate 40, which goes between Arkansas and Tennessee. I think you can see the Arkansas sign right there on it. And so they later built a bridge to honor, I guess, where he, crossed the Mississippi River. Here's another image, of course, showing Memphis. You can see downtown Memphis and all that in the background as well. But De Soto didn't make the whole expedition. If you know about it, he died. He died basically, halfway through it, I guess, or more than halfway through. And I think there's a story where they took De Soto and they buried him in the river, like on the bank of the river, because they didn't want the Native Americans to realize that De Soto wasn't a god. That was, I think, one thing that the Spanish told the natives, that they were gods or whatever, so that they wouldn't attack them, etc. Now, I'm also going to move on to talk about another famous conquistador that's well known. which is Coronado. Here, kind of show him right here. Francisco de Coronado. If you want his full name, it's Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, who originally was a governor of part of what is Mexico, like the western part of Mexico. Actual area called it's called Nueva Galicia. Actually, Nueva Galicia, I think, was the name of the actual. He was like a viceroy of that area, or governor of northern western part of Mexico. And what happened was Coronado heard about the stories of Cabeza de Vaca, which were kind of circulating after his expedition and all that. And so he got together this expedition to try and find the so-called lost cities of gold, which they believed were somewhere in the Americas. They also called it Cibola y Quivera, I think was the other name that they dubbed it. And so Coronado got together about 300 conquistadors. And he also got a couple thousand, 1 or 2,000, they think, Indians, Native American Indians / Colon Indians, to join up with him as well. And they started to push into the northern part of Mexico at that point. I think I've got a map showing you the expedition up through northern Mexico. Some of his men also explored the Gulf of California, which, by the way, had already been found by Hernán Cortés a little after his conquest of Mexico. You can see the route that Coronado took up into Arizona, where they think he went into first. And then he also explored, they think, into parts of New Mexico as well. And then you can see the expedition would actually go, it would go eastward. They would travel eastward through what the Great Plains is, northern Texas, like the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma. And then they believe that Coronado's expedition by 1541 had even reached into Kansas, believe it or not. The Spanish encountered a lot of these Native Americans of the Southwest you may have heard of, which were often called the Pueblo Indians, like the Zuni and the Hopi Indians, who, by the way, are very famous for living in these type of adobe mud houses you may have seen before that are well known. And Coronado really thought that some of these cities he found like that, like Quivera, I think that was in Kansas, might be, the lost cities of gold. And I think if you study about Coronado, he was a very ruthless man. Coronado, as the Spanish, go into the Americas, they try to convert all the natives to Catholicism, and if they didn't, they would kill them. Basically, kill them on the spot if they didn't want to convert, that kind of thing. And I think there was even this story where Coronado had this Indian guy. I think they called him the Turk for some reason, and he kept telling them that that the lost cities of gold are to the east somewhere. He kept taking him to the east and all that. And finally, I think they killed him. They killed the Turk and all that. But he never did find any gold, which was kind of a disappointment for him. There is a story you may have heard about where some of the Spanish, of course, first cite the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River Basin. That's really one of the most famous things that probably happened, that's well known, on Coronado's expedition, where this conquistador named Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, he's the one that actually discovered it, believe it or not. And they were kind of impressed with the view, of the Colorado Basin and the Grand Canyon. But I think in the end, a lot of the conquistadors just didn't care about it because they couldn't find any gold. So they were in search of gold, and so they didn't really have time to stay there. But they were the first really Europeans to really cite that big hole in the ground, that's now a big tourist attraction today, Grand Canyon. And so it's a mile high too. Like if you fall off, you fall down about a mile away. So anyway, I'm going to get into next, and I'm going to talk about also, of course, the most famous, really, of the whole conquistadors, which is really Hernán Cortés. He, of course, is well known for conquering Mexico and of course, the Aztec Empire, which he would do between 1519 to 1522, which took Cortés about 2 or 3 years to conquer it in the end. And Cortés, I've got a little short video I'll kind of share with you on Cortés to try to give you more of a background information about him. But Cortés is really considered, I think him and Pizarro are really the two most famous overall.
Hernán Cortés is remembered for conquering the Aztec Empire and also for being the first governor of New Spain.
Hernán Cortés was born around 1485 in Medellin, Spain, to a noble family.
Hernán Cortés left Spain in 1504 for Hispaniola and then ends up in Cuba in 1511.
Cortés convinced the Cuban governor to appoint him captain general of a large expedition to establish a colony in Mexico in 1518.
In Mexico, Cortés establishes Veracruz and has himself elected as the captain general.
Cortés chose to scuttle his ships so that there would not be a turning back to Cuba.
At the time, what is now Mexico was governed by the Aztecs, and Cortés set out for their capital, Tenochtitlan.
When he arrives in the capital, he meets Moctezuma, the emperor of the Aztec Empire, gives him gifts, and then promptly takes him hostage.
Cortés was distracted, however, when he learned that the Cuban governor sent a force to confront him. Leaving Pedro de Alvarado in charge of Tenochtitlan while he dealt with this new threat, Cortés took the Cuban commander hostage and then convinced the troops to switch sides and join him.
When Hernán Cortés returns to Tenochtitlan, he finds Tenochtitlan up in arms because Pedro de Alvarado, during his absence, massacred several priests, committed atrocities.
Cortés insisted that Montezuma intervene. Montezuma faced the rioting crowds and was killed by a rock thrown by protesters.
The Spanish are then driven from the city with considerable losses in what is called the Noche Triste, or sad night. And Cortés then is forced to regroup.
With the help of many native allies who did not like the Aztecs, Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in 1521, laid siege to the city, and finally conquered it.
In 1523, Cortés is named the Captain General of New Spain and Governor of Mexico.
Eventually, Cortés returned to exploring. He traveled through Central America and discovered California. In 1541, he retired to his estate in Sevilla, Spain, and died on December 2nd, 1547.
Cortés's legacy is a complex one. On one hand, he is the conqueror of Mexico. He brought and extended the Spanish Empire, but from the indigenous point of view, he was a mass murderer.
Conquering the Aztec Empire led to the destruction of one of the greatest civilizations that was known in the world at that time.
So yeah, Cortés conquered a lot, but like say, kind of like a mass murderer, I guess all the Native Americans that they of course killed, which I'll talk about a little bit later, of course, about. But anyway, yeah, a little bit of background about Cortés. Cortés was not really trained as a soldier. A lot of people don't know this about Cortés. He, of course, actually was studying law at the time when he heard about all the discoveries of the Americas. And he was also a trained notary and all that. And so he decided to come to the New World to seek his fortune and all that. And so I think originally he went to like Hispaniola and, of course, also Cuba as well. And so that's how Cortés, of course, gets there. And then he hears about Mexico and all that. And so he gets involved in, of course, conquering that as well. Cortés, by the way, was one of the best armed, of course, of the conquistadors. Part of why they were successful, the conquistadors, by the way, is that they had a lot of great, military equipment. They had armor, like cuirasses that protected their, body armor, crossbow, different kinds of swords. A lot of the steel and swords were made in like Toledo, Spain, if you know about that. Lances, early cannons were used, muskets also, and horses. Horses were kind of important too, as well. That, of course, made it a lot easier for the Spanish to come in and conquer. And then, of course, they talk about disease being also another thing that, of course, that helped the Spanish as well. On the other hand, the Aztecs and others like Native Americans, they may have had things like obsidian, like a volcanic stone or something like that, being used as weapons. So obviously that wasn't a match, for what obviously the Spanish had. Now, I'm going to get into what happens with Cortés. Cortés is going to eventually enter the Yucatan. It's in 1519. He only brings about 500 men with him when he invades into Mexico, with the Yucatan being the main area where he first encounters the Aztecs. And importantly, there's this woman they always talk about, I'll kind of mention about, that was kind of this mistress and translator of him, which was named Donna Marina. Donna Marina was kind of instrumental in Cortés conquering Mexico. She went by different names, by the way. She was this Maya slave girl that he acquired in the Yucatan. But she knew the Aztec language, which is sometimes called Nahuatl, if you want. And so she would help to translate and, basically give Cortés an edge because he understood the Aztecs and their language. And so that was a big advantage that he had. A lot of the Spanish and Mexicans later called her either La Malinche or Malintzin, I think is another variation. I know they called sometimes Cortés El Malinche, which meant, I think it means the captain. And so I think La Malinche means the captain's woman, basically. I think they had a child together, which was, I want to say his name was Martin Cortés, and they consider him to be the first mestizo that's actually born afterwards. But one of the things, of course, that, Cortés is well known for is his conquest of the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire was this Native American empire that was located in the central part of Mexico, or Mesoamerica, as they also called it. And it was actually a confederation of tribes that were there that controlled the area around what is called Lake Texcoco, which is kind of like where Mexico City is now today. And they were called different names. I think some people called them the Azteca or Aztec, or even the Mexica, I think was another name that were used. I think their language was Nahuatl, so they're called sometimes the Nahuatl people as well. That's the route that Cortés would take, of course, in his conquest of Mexico. He does help to found the city of Veracruz, you may have heard of, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, on the east coast of Mexico. But you can see he would push westward with his conquistadors. And they actually would reach the city called Tlaxcala, which you'll see there later. That's an important city because a lot of that Native American culture would actually join with the Spanish because they hated the Aztecs. And so you had some Native Americans that supported the conquest of Mexico, believe it or not, because they didn't like the Aztecs and all that. Of course, the thing that's famous is, of course, in 1519, in November of that year, you've got, of course, Cortés entering the capital of the Aztec Empire, which is called Tenochtitlan, which it was actually built on a lake, Lake Texcoco, which most of it's been drained, and it was built on an island which had these causeways or bridges that ran to it in the middle there. And at the time, they say that capital was considered to be one of the greatest capitals in the New World that was ever built. The Aztecs were highly advanced culture and civilization, but as you know, it would be, of course, conquered and snuffed out by Cortés, of course, and the Spanish. If you know about it, one of the last rulers, of course, of the Aztecs was a ruler named Montezuma, or Montezuma II. They also call it Moctezuma as well. You spell the C, actually, but usually pronounced with a N sound to it. He's one of the last major rulers, of course, of the Aztec Empire. And there's a kind of a story about this, which they think is true, but a lot of the Aztecs thought that the Spanish might be gods. And there was a claim that Cortés was an actual god, they thought, which was the god named Quetzalcoatl, which was the so-called feather serpent god. And so when Cortés arrived in 1519 to the capital of Tenochtitlan, they actually believed this. And the reason why was because there was a legend about Quetzalcoatl, which was a so-called feather serpent god, that he had been exiled from Mexico, and that one day he would come back. And so I think Quetzalcoatl was supposed to have a beard and a chalky white face, kind of like the Europeans had. And so they actually thought this about Cortés. So Cortés enters, of course, Tenochtitlan. They kind of put him up in the palace. Well, even at the palace of course, Montezuma. And there's a famous location which is in Mexico City today, which is called the Hospital de Jesus Nazareno. Supposedly that location of where that courtyard is, which is right there, is supposedly where the actual two worlds met, where Cortés met Montezuma. I think he's even put like paintings and murals that are in there as well, where the two would actually meet. The hospital itself was actually built later by Hernán Cortés after he conquered Mexico. I think the murals in there, I think, are more unique to more modern times. They were put there later. Now, what happened was, about what happened between Cortés and Montezuma. Cortés would eventually seize power. This is by 1520. I think at one point Montezuma had put Cortés up in the palace, and what happened was Cortés decided to take control of Mexico by using Montezuma as a puppet, and so he took him hostage, basically. And so Montezuma basically fell under the spell of Cortés in the Spanish. But eventually what happened was, they say in what is June of 1520, the Aztecs rebel, what they call La Noche Triste, which means the sad night. And on the night of June 30th, 1520, the Aztecs rebel. In fact, you know about it, Montezuma was killed by them, and they basically forced Cortés to flee the actual island capital, and I think a lot of their men halfway across the Lake Texcoco, a lot of them were captured and killed by the Aztecs. So he was barely able to get out alive with his men, and the Spanish later called it basically La Noche Triste, which means the sad night, or sometimes the night of rain, or something like that, or tears. I think it's also called as well. There's a famous tree there, which is in Mexico City, which is called the Tree of Sad Night, which you see at the top right there. It's actually an old saber tree, which still exists there. Supposedly at that point on the other side of the lake, when he had reached there at that point, and he was able to escape. But what's going to happen is Cortés then would go back. He would actually go back to the Tlaxcalans and get reinforcements from them, like Native American reinforcements. And so that's going to really help to allow Cortés to come back and retake the city, which he'll do by the summer of 1521. And so with thousands of Native Americans, and I think also probably a few thousand conquistadors, he was able to eventually lay siege to the city. And I don't know if you know much about the story about this, but one of the things that Cortés did to lay siege to Tenochtitlan, he built a bunch of brigantine ships, like basically sailing ships, like two massive ships, about 1520 of them, I think, were constructed overland, and they were dragged to the actual where the capital is. And so he uses armies with ships to actually lay siege to the whole city. And so the actual siege would last like 3 or 4 months until they eventually capitulated, of course, in August of 1521. Of course, if you know much about, the whole, conquest of Mexico, it did involve a lot of atrocities. They're not sure the exact number or whatever, but they do think that maybe as many as 40,000 or more Aztecs were killed in the conquest of Tenochtitlan. And of course, afterwards, the Spanish would then begin to basically destroy the old city. Now, here's kind of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. And I think at one point they had huge temples that were there that had been constructed to some of their gods, like the war god Huitzilopochtli, you may have heard of, so-called war god that they would sacrifice people to, if you know about this, like POWs. And the Spanish saw this as being gruesome because a lot of the Native Americans were, cannibals, killing people and ripping their hearts out and all those kind of things. And they were pagan and not Christian. And so that's part of why they wanted to convert them and all that, of course, later. Here's another, and of course, Mexico City, if you know about it, will later be, founded right afterwards. The old capital of Tenochtitlan is built on top of, by the Spanish afterwards. And Cortés even becomes one of the first governors, of course, of New Spain and Mexico afterwards. And he actually ended up being, if you study about Cortés, Cortés ends up being really one of the most wealthiest of the different conquistadors, because he ends up, I think, going back to Spain afterwards, living the rest of his life afterwards. I think he got married or something like that as well. And so, yeah, Cortés was definitely considered one of the most ruthless, of course, of the conquistadors, I think, overall. Him and Pizarro, I think, is the other one, of course, that's pretty awful. I'm going to talk about Pizarro later. I'll kind of get into and talk about him. And I think Nadia had a question about the religious missionaries. I think you were talking about how, what was the point of why they wanted to convert everybody and all that. Well, obviously, all these peoples living like in the New World, of course, in the Old World, I guess they see them as pagans, worshiping all these, pagan gods. And I guess in the New World, doing pagan things and human sacrifice and stuff like that, which they weren't doing, by the way. And so they wanted to convert them into being Christian like they are. I guess to civilize them, even though they have their own civilization, that kind of thing, etc. But that's kind of their view, of that. So anyways, that's kind of what that's about, of course. But later in the week, I'll move on. I'm going to, of course, kind of continue talking about the conquest, of course, the Americas. But again, like I said, get into Francisco Pizarro. Yeah, him and Cortés. I think those two are really the most ruthless overall. I'll probably show you a video too, kind of giving you an idea of like why the Spanish were so superior, like the conquistadors when they came in. I'll show you kind of a video later on like the weaponry they had that's, pretty superior and why they're able to conquer and all that. We'll get into that. But I'll talk about early colonization. The Spanish come in, they begin to break up the conquested areas in the different viceroyalties or colonies that they have. I'll also talk about how they exploit a lot of the Native American culture. That's something that they're kind of known for. Like you may have heard of the encomienda, that's real famous overall. So I'll get into that as well. So I'll talk about that later in the week, which I guess will be Wednesday. So that's it for today. Don't forget, I mentioned earlier that I think y'all had some assignments that are out right now. I know the Reformation quiz will be due at the end of the week. Probably give you a couple more days on it or whatever. Then the exploration quiz will be due, I think, early next week sometime. Sometime next week I'll have that due. Probably give you a couple more days on that. But like I said, keep sending me information about whatever book you want to do for your book report. I think I've had 3 people sign up for the Veterans Project. If you're still interested in that, please let me know about that as well. So that's it for today. If you got a comment, question, later about this lecture, you can, of course, leave it on my channel, or you can email me, of course, if you got a question about the class. So that's it for now. I'll send out the later email, of course, about tomorrow's lecture, part 2, of course, on the Conquistadors. So that's it for today. Hope y'all have a great week and all that. Okay, week 2. So y'all take care.